Thank you. It is such a pleasure to be here with my dear friends, and I think of my Australian friends as brothers and sisters because we are really sibling countries. And I was in Melbourne just as recently as January. It is so lovely to see Tony and John, and I understand I'll see Field and Leonie in just a few minutes. And others of you, I can't make you all out because you're very teeny tiny on my screen, but I know there are lots of my other friends there in the audience. And I am thankful for the wonders of modern technology to bring us together. I will just say very quickly that I think there's a great deal of promise going on in the work that is now underway in Australia. And I think there are some areas where you might learn from the example of those who have gone before you, including the United States. The definition of a wise person, they say, is someone who learns from his or her own mistakes, but a wiser person learns from the mistakes of others. And so I'm going to share some of those with you also. I am in the middle of an international study of teaching policy in Australia, particularly focused in on New South Wales. And I want to thank Anne McIntyre, who is part of the team there, and also Victoria. We're looking at China, particularly Hong Kong and Shanghai, Finland, Singapore, Canada, particularly Alberta and Ontario. And I'm going to reflect on Australia's strategies from that perspective, as well as from my visit there directly and my experience in the United States. The first point I want to make is that Australia is pursuing the power of standards in some brilliant ways. The work of ACARA around the curriculum standards that will soon inform new assessments and resources, the work of ETSL that was just described by John, is really brilliant work. The standards suggest a rich and empowering 21st century curriculum, the kinds of teaching and leadership competencies that are needed to deliver that curriculum. I've read your standards, and they actually give me goosebumps in a good way. There's a lot of powerful ideas there. Of course, standards can always be further refined and polished and should be living and breathing documents. And I know that that process is underway. But I think you are off to an excellent start. But as John already said, creating standards is just the beginning. The standards do not teach themselves. And the United States has been engaged in standards-based reform since the early 1990s. And so we have quite a bit of learning about what does and does not work in that area. I want to take a minute to say a word about that before I talk more specifically about ideas around the world that may be helpful to you. The first thing I want to remind us all is that the theory of standards-based reform is that after one identifies the sort of goals that one wants students to achieve, they need to be followed by development of curriculum that is useful, materials, instruction, redesign of school organizations if that is needed to really deliver the standards. Preparation should be aligned, professional development for both teachers and leaders. Resources are supposed to then be invested as is needed to do all of those things, including wraparound services for students who may need them to be able to engage with the standards. And then finally, assessments, which give us some indication of how people are moving toward the standards. So if we think about the standards and the assessments, this is a U.S. metaphor for the good old hamburger. We had that commercial that was very famous in the U.S., where's the beef between the buns? All of that curriculum, instruction, professional development, preparation, school investments is the beef. And the standards and the tests or the assessments are the buns. It's very important to think about where's the beef between the buns when you're doing standards-based reform. So much for my bad metaphor, but the cases I would point to in the U.S. are dramatically different across the states. You take a state like Massachusetts, which today is our highest achieving state, and has been that way for over a decade. And what did they do in the early 1990s? The first thing they did was they redesigned school funding so that they allocated funds equally and added a weight for students in poverty, English learners, special education students, so that those students received more money, the schools that served them, and the funding base was both raised and made much more equitable. That was really the foundation, and later studies found that that's what really drove much of the higher achievement. They also put in place thoughtful standards that really had a 21st century conception of learning. They put in place open-ended assessments, which are pretty rare in the United States, that were reasonably good at capturing the standards. They put in place preschool education for all low-income students so that there would not be an achievement gap before kindergarten. They put in place very intensive preparation, raised the standards for entering teaching, raised the standards for accrediting schools of education. They put in place professional development, literacy, numeracy, and other professional development projects. They did not forget about science and social studies, history, and the arts. They put in place very substantial and thoughtful programs for students with special education needs. And that set of things is what drove a very robust and very high quality reform. But in the worst cases, we had states that basically implemented standards as testing without anything in between. They, in some cases, also implemented testing without investing, with low quality multiple choice tests attached to high stakes consequences for students, teachers, and schools, which drove learning toward test prep and teaching for the tests. And that was in fact codified as the strategy in the year 2001 for No Child Left Behind, which is a law that has now been in effect for more than a decade. It has not been reauthorized because nobody agrees on how to even think about reauthorizing it. It's just sitting there, generally recognized now as not having worked. Everyone from our Secretary of Education to people in the states and localities agree on that. We kind of call it No Child's Behind Left at this point. There's been a huge backlash against high stakes testing. And in fact, this strategy has not worked. Our PISA scores in the United States between 2000 and 2012, as we've been doubling down on that mode of reform, have gone down in every subject area, in math, science, and reading. If this kind of approach was going to work, we should have seen some positive improvement since then. And in fact, the approach that we've taken to standards as testing has constrained and dumbed down the curriculum. It's pushed out initiatives to develop 21st century skills. There's less research and inquiry and collaborative problem solving and communication in many schools than there was before. In California, we kind of think of ourselves as our own country. We've begun to redefine the whole agenda and are rethinking all of these components right now. But it's very interesting to note that one of our major employers here in Silicon Valley, which you will be familiar with, Google, does not use the test scores of students at all in its hiring because they find that they're completely unpredictive of what they care about, which is creativity and the ability to learn to learn. In fact, John talked about tests of learning as opposed to tests of achievement. And I will argue that you have some of the better examples of those in Australia, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So the moral of the story is, number one, that assessments do matter, and that you have to, secondly, pay attention to what's between the buttons and keep asking the question as you pursue these standards-based reforms about where's the beef. Where are all those other pieces, the investments, the curriculum, the supports for teaching, the professional learning for teachers and school leaders that will make a difference in making these standards come alive?